Hello everyone, Andrew Martin here, and welcome along to the BCM Game of the Month. Once again, this time for March 2014. And I've chosen a game for you from the Gibraltar's Masters tournament, which as you know took place in January earlier this year. What I particularly like about this game is that it could easily be overlooked. I think there's a tendency when we are playing through games from a tournament to tend to concentrate on the games between the best players or the highest rated players. Well, this is a game between Arne Hagesaether from Norway, grade 2126, and the formidable Viktorija Cmiylte, one of the strongest female players in the world, 2515, playing with black. And it's a very interesting example of the pressure black can bring to bear against that 2f4 Sicilian with d5. Now f4, well, that was regarded as an improvement on the usual Grand Prix attack method with knight c3. f4, more direct. White might not need to play knight c3 at all. But recently, the move d5 has proved a bit of a thorn in White's side if he wants to try for an advantage. This is an immediate challenge to the pawn at e4. Obviously, White can push on here, but then Black finds it very easy to develop his pieces, and in particular this possible problem child on c8 can easily come out to a good square, something like this. Just dropping back, Mark Hebden made a living out of knight c3 back in the 1980s in England. Just taking advantage really of Black's unfamiliarity with this position, d takes e4, knight takes e4, but objectively this is not that good for White. It is complicated though. Queen c7 is just one move for Black. But the usual move, going back to d5, is to take on d5. And now we reach a position after knight f6 where Black is willing to sacrifice a pawn early on in the opening to get his development flowing. And in practice, most strong players like this method of play. The pawn on f4 looks slightly out of place in this position. So White's got it all to do to justify the position of that pawn. Well, White in this game plays the theoretical recommendation. He checks on b5, which puts a slight spanner in Black's works, and then he plays c4, getting his bishop outside the pawn chain before that move. But Cmiylte is very calm. She plays a6, already noting that if White drops back with bishop a4, moves like b5 are very much in the offing. This is a thematic move by Black, breaking up the White centre and gaining very active play. So not wishing to lose any time and going back to the game now, White chops on d7, Black takes back with the bishop, White plays knight f3, hastening to castle, and now here is the pawn sacrifice, the thematic e6. We note immediately the potential power of Black's light squared bishop, and that's what the initial play in this variation is all about. Can White nullify the power of that bishop? Well, he plays queen e2, and Black breaks the pin on the pawn with bishop e7. And now in view of Black's threat of e takes d5, White's got to take, and Black takes back with a bishop. Well, now we reach a position where Black has obvious compensation for the pawn, a good initiative, and it's very easy to see squares for the major pieces. For White, it's not so easy. Despite the extra pawn, White's got to struggle to complete his development. Typical play after, let's say, castles may go like this. Black castles, White plays knight c3, Black brings the rook to the same file as the White queen, White plays d3, and now a pointed attack against the White position. And if rook d1, protecting the pawn, bishop d6, queen c7, White protects his pawn, and now rook a d8. This sort of sequence is the reason Black players like this variation for themselves. Black gets a nice initiative, the pawn is of no consequence yet. White is really struggling to complete development. For Black, it all just flows along. Reminiscent of the Benko Gambit in many ways, and the free-flowing development, and nice easy moves Black gets in return for the pawn. So going back to the game itself, White plays b3, a slightly more challenging move, intending perhaps bishop b2. Well, clearly Black can castle now, but bishop f5 was a very good move, so that if white castles, bishop d3 picks up the exchange. Knight c3. Well, this threat of bishop d3 is nasty, and white can try and break it up by pushing the pawn to d4, so that after c takes d4, he's got two ways to try and throw a spanner in the works. Firstly, he can try the move bishop a3, but I think black can satisfactorily answer that with knight to e4. If takes on e7, we take back with the queen. As you can see, white's got some problems on the long diagonal and on the e file. And if knight bd2 here, we go d3, jamming up the white position. Castles, rook he8. We've got the same type of free-flowing game that we had before. I like black in this position, and white's not a pawn up anymore. So going back to bishop f5, let's try this one more time. d4, c takes d4. Can white improve here with the annoying move queen to e5? Well, it turns out queen to d7 is quite a good move for black. There was an old game where black took on b1. That's okay, but I don't think it's necessary to surrender the bishop just yet. You can actually give the d pawn here. And there are two variations. If white takes with the queen, we castle on the queen side. Takes with the knight. Well, black's threatening bishop f6, so bishop b2 and now knight c5. With terrific compensation. Very hard position for white, this, to defend. Going back one more time, let's run it again. d4, c takes d4, queen e5, queen d7. White can take with the knight. But this configuration of pieces in the centre is not ideal. And in fact, it turns out knight g4 is very good here, overloading the white queen. If the queen takes the bishop on f5, queen takes on d4. Very unpleasant for white. So black probably forces white to play queen d5, and then I think we just go bishop f6. And if knight takes f5, we have the surprising but excellent castles in this position. And white's position starts to creak. So some interesting lines there, and perhaps they have helped to explain why Hagesaether played knight c3. But of course that allows the black bishop in, so in came Cmiylte's bishop. Queen went to f2, black castled, and now we get a period of the game where white is thinking about castling perhaps on the queen side. Black deters him by playing b5. White puts the knight in, trying to get rid of the bishop. Cmiylte puts her rook on e8. White goes queen f3. And now bishop d6. Again, a very interesting move, and perhaps unexpected for white. Now, at first sight, this looks like a mistake, because what is to stop white from taking on d3? But then, I think Cmiylte intended this splendid move here. Bishop takes e5. And if queen takes c8, queen takes d8, excuse me, we have the superb move, bishop takes c3 check. Yes, it's true, it really does work. If queen takes e8 check, we go rook takes e8 check, king d1, and now bishop takes b2. And black is suddenly material ahead. Meanwhile, a melee comes onto the board after queen takes d3, bishop takes e5, queen takes d8, bishop takes c3, king to d1. When black scoops up an extraordinary amount of material for the queen here by just clearing out the long diagonal. And after rook e1, rook ec8, okay, it's complicated, but with three pieces for the queen, rook, bishop and knight, you have to prefer black. So going back once more to the position in the game after bishop d6, this is not so easy for white. I mean, if he castles, let's say, that's another possibility. Then we just take on c4. Knight takes c4, bishop takes, b takes. I mean, this may be defensible for white, something like this. But, you know, maybe white can just take on e8 in this position and try and defend it. But looking at the position in your mind's eye, you know, 4 or 5 moves previous, you know, it's hard to judge this sort of position properly. You'd immediately think that, you know, black had a very good position here, but maybe white can hold this. However, returning finally to the game, one can easily understand why Hagesaether didn't castle on the queen side, and instead he preferred the move knight to e2. Well, black took on c4, and white sensibly castled. This allowed bishop e4, but white put his queen on c3, hoping after c takes b3 to start some action against the black king position. Bishop d5. Maybe not best. It turns out that actually in this position b takes a2 might be best. And if knight takes e4 we take back. And if queen c4 we can play bishop takes e5 in this position. But all this is hinging on the tactics after f takes e5, queen takes d2. Can black possibly get away with this, allowing white to take on f7? Well, it turns out, using the computer, that I found that he can. Rook takes a2, queen e3 check. Black is better in this situation. But again, one can see why she doesn't go for that. Why would you allow the white queen in on f7 when you can avoid it? So I think that's why black tries to avoid the tactics, playing bishop d5. Hagesaether played knight g4, and only now black takes on a2. Well calculated, not fearing the capture on f6. Hagesaether played knight to f5. It looks like trouble is brewing around the white king. Now if we just take play back, what happens if white gets the vacuum cleaner out and starts taking everything on f6? Yes, knight h5 is better than bishop takes f6. It looks dangerous. I think black has two more than adequate moves here. The first of these is king f8. And if knight takes f6, we go rook e2. If knight takes d5, we go rook takes d2. Again, I should stress, all this was found with the help of computers. It's not a variation that is instinctive, because, you know, black is giving up his pride and joy, the bishop, in order to land this tactic on d2. But it turns out after knight b6, rook takes b2, knight takes a8, and then the remarkable move c4, black is still much better in this situation. Well, that's one variation, completely counterintuitive. Knight takes f6, queen takes, g takes, knight h5. I think a more natural move here, rather than king f8, is bishop c4. Knight takes f6 check, king f8, knight takes h7 check, king e7, rook fe1 check, king d8. Maybe this is the variation Cmiylte calculated over the board, and she just understood that if white wasn't landing a killer punch here, then basically black is winning, because there's no way for white to evade the eventual promotion of this pawn on a2. Really tying down the rook on a1, taking a whole white unit out of the action. So that probably wins, and that's probably, going back to the game, why white preferred knight f5. But in this situation, even now, bishop f8 was an excellent move. Very calm defence. White played knight f8 check. At every stage it looks as though he's working something up, but black has adequate defensive resources. Now, just taking play back, once again we have to consider the consequences of taking on f6. Excuse me. Knight takes f6 check. Black takes back with the queen, forcing the exchange. And now knight to e3. But it's hard to imagine this is anything other than a temporary solution. I mean, I really like that pawn on a2 here. Black could even provoke white's pawn forward before the bishop goes to b3. Knight comes to g4. And black defends easily enough with bishop e7 and then king f8. Again, this pawn on a2 is hard to shift, and if white can't shift it, then eventually it's going to win. So once again he goes knight f8 check. Black puts the king in the corner, very calm. White goes knight e3. Cmiylte plays rook a7. I mean, perhaps technically rook b8 is slightly stronger here, but rook a7, nothing wrong with it. White goes queen to d3, attacking the bishop again. Bishop drops back to e6, And now with the queens coming off, it's hard to believe in white's position anymore. But actually, it was difficult to retain the queens because after queen c2, I think black can now take on h6. And the bishop on f8 is about to become a sterling defender. So going back to the game, my impression is the complications had led to some sort of time shortage, perhaps for both players here, certainly for white. He continues to try and hack away at black's king, but funnily enough, black's fortified king position is as solid as a rock, and white can't make any impression at all. Perhaps very short of time, he plays bishop takes f6, g takes f6, but after knight hg4, c4, the attack was at an end, and black is threatening numerous things, perhaps the most potent of which is bishop c5. And failing all else, the c-pawn will just march its merry way up the board. So a very interesting example of the f4 Sicilian there. And if we just return to f4, I think I have to say that I recommend the move d5. It's known these days that this is the move that gives the f4 player most problems. On the evidence of games like these, perhaps white will have to return to the Hebden method of playing knight c3 and just try and play the strange sort of positions that arise as a result.